Sean Diddy Combs has just filed a brand new bid to get out of jail before his sentencing in a few months. From arguing he shouldn't be locked up for his swinger lifestyle, to highlighting the atrocious conditions at the MDC, to addressing allegations of violence, he is fighting for his life in this new letter to the judge.
This story is spiraling fast, and the noise around it is getting louder by the hour. A global entertainment figure, a man who once stood at the top of the music industry with power, influence, and a carefully built empire.
Be released from jail. I know I've asked that question before so many different times here on Sidebar, but we have right now a brand new request from his legal team, a brand new filing from his defense team arguing for why he should be released now after that monumental verdict in his criminal case several weeks ago. The circumstances have changed, and I will tell you what, we did an interview a few weeks back that kind of previewed why and how Combs could be released. It was a bail bondsman that is apparently working with Diddy's team behind the scenes. I'm going to get to that a little bit later, but what I want to talk about right now is this latest letter from the defense to the judge overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian. Remember, this comes after a jury of Combs' peers found him not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, not guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, but they did convict him of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. He's set to be sentenced on October 3rd. Technically, he could face up to 10 years in prison on each charge. Highly unlikely. Think maybe you might be looking at somewhere to 2 to 5 years potentially, but he could also get time served and be released, although that also seems unlikely. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But initially, after the verdict, right after the verdict, his defense team petitioned the court that he should be released. He was just acquitted of some very serious charges. The judge denied it. The judge denied Combs bail once again. And remember, this comes after he was rejected bail multiple times since he was arrested back in September of 2024, highlighting the severity of the charges, the violence, and so forth. But now, this is different. Now, what is the defense arguing? I'm going to go over all this in the new letter. I'm going to give my take at the end about whether or not it's going to be successful and whether or not he will actually be released before sentencing in October. So, the defense begins by arguing that Sean Combs should be released in advance of sentencing, and the court has the power to do this. They have the authority, among other things, because you can clearly show, quote, that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. So, what are those exceptions? What are those reasons? What are those circumstances that are exceptional? They highlight several things that we're going to get into. That the charges he was convicted of, we're going to call them the Mann Act violations, that's what it's called under the law. They're not as severe, they're not as egregious as other convictions in other cases. That the sheer fact that he's locked up at the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, for the past 11 months, that in and of itself is a reason for him to be released. These are all exceptional circumstances, and I'm going to get into all the arguments. But first, they highlight the standard, and they argue that to be released under federal law, you need to show 2 conditions. First, the district court must find by clear and convincing evidence that the person is not likely to flee or pose a danger to the safety of any other person or the community if released. Second, it must be clearly shown that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. Now, clear and convincing evidence is a lower standard, by the way. It's not like beyond a reasonable doubt. Anyway, basically, you have to show he's not a flight risk, he's not a danger, and you have to show there are particular, exceptional, unique reasons for why detaining Combs is wrong. We're going to start with the exceptional reasons justifying his release. And they begin by trying to define, well, what exactly is exceptional circumstances? What does that mean? And they argue that case law suggests a court has a lot of discretion to determine whether a particular set of circumstances qualifies as exceptions. And they say, look, Sean Combs, his case, so different from other ones. There has never been, according to them, a Mann Act prosecution like this one before.
Is now reportedly under emergency watch inside a prison facility after an alleged assault left him in serious condition. That is the headline shaking timelines right now. The same man who once controlled stages, deals, and headlines is now reportedly fighting for stability behind concrete walls and steel doors. The contrast alone is enough to make people stop scrolling. For years, this individual represented dominance in business and culture. He built brands, signed artists, shaped sounds, and projected an image of untouchable authority. Cameras followed him, crowds cheered him, corporations partnered with him. He moved through exclusive rooms like he owned them. Now, According to circulating reports, he is under constant supervision in a controlled cell, possibly separated for his own protection after an alleged prison assault changed everything overnight. Prison is a different world. It does not care about platinum records. It does not care.
And this is how they lay it out. Quote, "There has literally never been a case like this one, where a person and his girlfriend arrange for adult men to have consensual sexual relations with the adult long-term girlfriend as part of a demonstrated swingers lifestyle and has been prosecuted and incarcerated under the Mann Act. Combs and two of his longtime girlfriends had a private, intimate life that is not uncommon today." They're talking about Jane and Cassie Ventura. Quote, "It may not have been common on June 25th, 1910, when the Mann Act, or as it was originally called, the White Slave Traffic Act, was passed, but attitudes about sex and morality have come a long way in the last 115 years. It is worth noting that when the Mann Act was passed to protect the morals and decency of America's women were not allowed to vote. As noted below, perhaps due to the troubling background of this statute, whose history is rich with both racism and misogyny, the Department of Justice has limited its application to those people profiting financially from the business of prostitution and not using it to prosecute consensual adults for their own lifestyles." By the way, we covered this on a previous sidebar. The defense made an argument months ago to have these charges thrown out, called it basically racially motivated, that it was strange that it was being used against a successful black man. That argument didn't work. He was ultimately prosecuted and he was convicted. Expressed interest and enthusiasm in her intimate life with Combs, including what they called freak-offs. Jane and Sean Combs had threesomes too. When Jane and Combs watched pornography together, Jane testified that she contacted two different porn stars and invited them to join her and Mr. Combs. Both Miss Ventura and Jane testified that very often they would see the same men over and over again for years. In July of 2024, Jane testified, for instance, that she suggested to Mr. Combs that they call Paul. Jane explained that she told Combs she, quote, missed Paul. When asked why she said that, she responded, "Because I did." This was a lifestyle, one that both Miss Ventura and Jane chose, one they all, as grown adults, had a right to choose. Like many aspects of sex and intimacy, it was not without its complications, its bouts of jealousy, and at times, its frustrations. But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were, serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this because, again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used or that fraud was used or threats were used. It was just, did you transport these women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts? And obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has
care about boardroom deals. It does not care about red carpet history. Inside those walls, hierarchy shifts, reputation transforms, power recalculates. When someone enters that environment carrying a larger-than-life public image, that image does not function the same way it did outside. In some cases it becomes a target. In other cases it becomes a liability. In many cases it becomes both. Reports claim the situation escalated quickly. What started as tension allegedly turned physical. Details remain scattered, conflicting, and in some cases exaggerated, but the consistent thread is that something serious occurred. Enough to trigger emergency watch. Enough to move medical teams. Enough to restrict movement. Enough to make officials reassess housing conditions and security protocols. Emergency watch is not casual. It is not routine. It signals concern. It signals risk. It signals vulnerability, whether that vulnerability is physical, mental, or situational. It means
it's been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. that Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, two of the three locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional.
Authorities believe heightened supervision is necessary. That alone shifts the narrative. The story is no longer about past charges, past power, or past influence. The story becomes survival. People online are reacting in predictable waves. Some express sympathy, arguing that no one deserves violence behind bars regardless of their alleged crimes. Others respond with cold indifference, claiming that consequences are unfolding exactly as expected. Then there are those dissecting every rumor, amplifying unverified details, turning fragments into full-blown theories. Social media has turned this situation into a digital arena where outrage, mockery, concern, and speculation collide nonstop. But strip away the noise and the situation remains stark. A once dominant public figure is reportedly injured and under watch in a prison system that does not forgive weakness. The psychology of that shift cannot be overstated. Going from commanding stages to navigating inmate politics is a violent transition in itself. The ego adjustment alone can destabilize anyone. Add alleged physical confrontation to that environment.
Or anything like that. That's another story for another day. But Meredith Foster was making these arguments for the government, and it seems like at first they were kind of talking about challenging the jury instructions, particularly, and they cited some cases, one from 2025, USA versus Kelly, and how the defendant in that case argued on appeal that it was unconstitutionally vague for Mann Act and RICO conspiracy. But the government was pretty much arguing that this should have been raised pre-trial. They were citing cases from 2003, 1973, just about the broader concerns. But the government was saying it felt like the defense was kind of taking a second bite of the apple. They were encouraging, or the government was saying that the defense is encouraging the defendant to raise these claims afterwards, and says that the defense didn't raise these issues until even after trial. And it says that it should have been kind of raised during the indictment phase. Whereas Alexandra Shapiro, who was making the defense arguments, she was saying that the law on Rule 12 is extremely restrictive. And she says that there's no way to make this argument at an earlier point because this was kind of a result of the acquittal, because he was found not guilty of RICO conspiracy and sex trafficking, victim one, and Jane, victim one being Cassie Ventura. And so the defense was saying that they were unable to make that argument any earlier, and so they were kind of trying to do it now because that was the most appropriate time for them.
You put that to the side about the timing of the judges. Okay, put the timing aside. I go now to the substance, whether or not there are substantive, real grounds to throw these convictions out. One of the arguments, and I have to say a lot of these have actually been consistent with arguments that were made in prior filings by the defense. One of them is, and if I'm understanding correctly, Sean Combs didn't make any money off of this prostitution, or he didn't pay for it himself, right? There's like a commercial aspect argument. What did they say?
Yeah, so initially they were going to be asking kind of 4 questions, then that both sides had to answer these questions. So this was brought up during question 2 about whether or not the Mann Act prosecution had a financial motive and whether or not the defendant kind of fall under the second liability, which is something I completely didn't know about because I'm not a lawyer or anything like that. But it was interesting kind of hearing those arguments. So the defense, starting off, that also being Alexandra Shapiro, she was saying that the statute should be construed narrowly to pimps and prostitution. She said that Mr. Combs was an alleged consumer and that this is just kind of a wire type of case. And it seemed like that's what the defense's whole argument was, that he was just financially giving the money, but it wasn't that he was necessarily making the money. And so the judge said, well, why wouldn't Combs be liable for willfully under that willfully causing theory? And the defense said no, because it's talking about the transportation aspect and the mens reas that people would engage.
Intent.
Yes, exactly. And the intent that people would engage in prostitution. You can't say that he's willfully doing that necessarily because he, in essence, was just watching 2 people have sex, pretty much. And so the defense was talking about the money aspect and how they previously argued that, you know, the money was for time. It wasn't necessarily for sexual purposes. It wasn't that typical pimp prostitute situation like that they were trying to make that comparison to. And so the defense was saying that it seems to imply that Sean Combs' conviction was based off the money transaction. Because if you remember from those summary flight charts, it was very easy for the jury to draw those conclusions about this is how much money was paid, this is what this, when this flight happened. And the jury found in essence that when these hotel nights were happening, that this was for pretty much the process of transporting people across state lines for the purposes of prostitution. Whereas the government was saying that the conviction should still stand, that the defense is challenging the vagueness and the definition of prostitution specifically. And so the government said that this issue isn't whether the defendant himself.
And the equation becomes volatile. High-profile inmates often face unique pressures. Some are isolated for protection. Some are placed in units designed to separate them from general population. Some refuse protective custody out of pride. Every decision carries consequences. If the assault reports are accurate, it raises serious questions about facility management and inmate safety. High-profile cases usually trigger extra security measures. Surveillance is tighter, movement is monitored, interaction is limited. So how does an alleged assault severe enough to result in emergency watch occur under those conditions? Either security failed, tensions escalated beyond anticipation, or the environment itself became combustible despite preventive measures. There is also the mental strain factor. Incarceration changes rhythm, sleep patterns shift, trust disappears, paranoia increases. Every interaction becomes strategic. Every conversation carries weight. For someone who lived decades surrounded by loyalty purchased through status and wealth, The sudden absence of control can
Engaged in prostitution and specifically in sexual acts. It's whether the defendant transported a person across state lines or international lines for the purposes of sex. And so the government argued that he facilitated the transportation with intent. And even though Cassie and Jane, and that's kind of where that first liability, secondary liability come in, where Cassie and Jane were the ones that the government was kind of saying were the ones who were contacting these entertainers or these escorts. But it was Diddy or Sean Combs who had that second liability because he watched, but he also provided the money.
Like he aided and abetted
Yes,
it in a way.
exactly. And so they argued.
Because it's not like a traditional case where someone, had this organization that was shipping off prostitutes to different people and this wide network. Yeah, but that's not necessarily what's required of this law. It's, did you transport people across lines for the purposes of sex work? Right. And I hear that, and I hear that argument.
And
yeah.
I was going to say, and the defense kind of, brought it back too later, where they were saying that the government hasn't raised to the jury the secondary liability, and that speaks volumes. So Alexandra Shapiro making that argument, and she says that they don't contest that the money came from Sean Combs. That's what I thought was interesting in their argument.
Because don't you remember during the trial how much evidence was there?
Yeah.
That the money either came from him, or he was on the phone, or there was voice notes or messages, right? That he was directing all of it.
Exactly. And so in kind of that last hurrah to save this argument, the defense said that the Mann Act actually historically is an embarrassment to the United States, because that's where they kind of brought in that racial undertone that it was.
Can you explain that? They've said consistently it's racist. What did they say about that? And then we'll get into the constitutional arguments, which I think are really interesting. But before that, what did they say about it being racist?
Well, this is an argument that they've made previously, right? This was an argument that they've been making for months on end, where essentially the law was drafted a long time ago in different times and different ages, where it's really just kind of talking about the slave trade and transporting persons across state lines. And so what the defense was pretty much saying, that the purposes of this law in general in 2020, in a 2025 lens, is not intended for what it was initially made for. And so what they're saying is nowadays that the DOJ, Department of Justice, is pretty much only prosecuting where it is kind of that typical sex trafficking in a way, people across state lines or minors. And so I think the defense's whole point that they were trying to drive home was that these were consenting adults who were coming across state lines. And what I thought was interesting too, Jesse, is I'm wondering if the money transaction wasn't there, if the prosecution wasn't able to find these money points, would we even be sitting here today?
Commercial can just means something of value. So if the escorts were receiving something of value to engage in this work, or the argument would be Jane or Cassie were receiving something of value in exchange
like a
for
fancy
this.
gift?
Yeah, I think they can make that argument. But you also do have money trail.
Yes, you do have
as
the
well.
money trail.
I mean, they did make their argument in prior filings suggesting he's a prominent black man who's being prosecuted for this, that it's not a tag along of like you see in other cases of a large sex trafficking network. He was convicted of that and that alone. And it does raise the question, if all they ever had were those charges and not racketeering and not sex trafficking, would they have even brought this case?
Yeah, and that's what the defense also pointed out today too.
We have to get into this First Amendment argument. Now,
and create psychological pressure that is difficult to describe. The public also tends to romanticize downfall. There is a strange fascination with watching powerful people fall. The higher they once stood, the more dramatic the descent appears. Headlines intensify it. Commentators amplify it. Every update becomes spectacle. But behind spectacle there is still a human body and a human nervous system absorbing impact. Emergency watch also means constant observation, lights on, guards monitoring, limited privacy. Psychological weight increases under that microscope. Even if physical wounds heal, the awareness of being watched at all times adds another layer of strain. The fall from luxury estates to institutional bedding is dramatic enough. Add alleged violence and it becomes cinematic in the worst way. For someone accustomed to control, the inability to dictate surroundings can feel suffocating. Public reaction will continue to split. Some see karma, some see tragedy, some see confirmation of guilt in every negative development. Others see a flawed system consuming another high-profile.
I've talked about this on a previous sidebar because it was in one of the defense's filings. This is a novel argument. This is very interesting. They're basically saying he is protected by the First Amendment And that this is simply voyeurism? Explain this to us.
Yes, and so that came up in question 4, which was answered before question 3. So just a little bit of out of order, but the question was whether the records show if every time an escort traveled across state lines or international lines were these encounters, hotel nights, freak-offs, were they always filmed? And so, and the other part 2 of that question was, does it even really matter? And so the government, in essence, was saying that no, it doesn't really matter, and that escorts were routinely filmed, and that the evidence at trial showed that while he frequently filmed the hotel nights or the freak-offs, they also talked about the exhibits showing the sex tapes, and those exhibits also correlate with the travel records. But the government says it's irrelevant, especially to talk about it, because the Mann Act is all about transportation and not necessarily filming. And so the government said that the act that violated the law was transportation. So when he transported the individuals across state lines, it was for the purposes of sex, that he's not just this amateur porn producer. Whereas the defense says, well, it doesn't matter if he always filmed the freak-offs or not, that he was a producer and a consumer of pornography, or amateur porn as they had called it, and that's protected by the First Amendment. And so Alexandra Shapiro, she said that he had a right as a consumer in order to, I guess, take part in him, in a way, I should say, and that adults have the right to consume pornography. Jane even brought up TV, something that we heard during testimony during the trial, so that way they could watch it during their movie nights, just videos of them in their hotel nights. And so the judge was like, well, what does this really have to do with the conviction for First Amendment issue? And then the defense kind of brought up OnlyFans, and just in essence that it's not illegal to consume it because he wasn't necessarily partaking in it. But I thought it was kind of an interesting argument.
I think their strongest part is not every encounter was filmed, right? If you're saying, well, he was just filming it for personal use, well, not every one of them was filmed. And they say it's about criminalizing traveling for prostitution, traveling for commercial sex. They talked about the Supreme Court case O'Brien, and that's where the Supreme Court upheld a federal law that said it was illegal to destroy draft cards. There was no First Amendment protection, and the court created what's called the O'Brien test for determining whether expressive conduct or symbolic speech, does it merit being protected by the First Amendment? The government would need to show significant government interest here. So here, what do they say? What is the government's interest in policing this, in criminalizing what he did? What is it? It's that just to regulate? Yeah.
Well, honestly, first, Jesse, you should have been inside that courtroom to give us all that little rundown of
I'm
what
sure it was
O'Brien
confusing,
meant.
yeah.
Because I truly was like, O'Brien,
Yeah,
just write down O'Brien so I
yeah.
could find it in my notes. Because again, no phone, no computer, nothing. Wasn't able to Google it. But the government said that they that regulating prostitution is of government interest. They say it's important to discourage violence against women, illegal drug use, preventing sexual assault. And they say within all 50 states, there are laws regulating prostitution. In all 50 states, depending on which state you're in, determine if there is a
File inmate. The truth will likely be more complex than the loudest takes. Others will argue that once inside, everyone is subject to the same risks, that notoriety does not guarantee immunity from harm, that the system operates on its own logic regardless of outside fame. The truth likely involves layers of both. Right now, the central image remains stark. A once powerful industry titan reportedly under emergency watch, health in question, future uncertain. The story is still developing, facts may evolve, reports may be clarified, but the symbolism has already landed. Dominance can evaporate, status can collapse, control can disappear. The entertainment world moves quickly. New headlines will replace this one eventually, but this moment marks a dramatic chapter in a saga that continues to unfold in public view. Behind the commentary and speculation, there is a stark reminder about consequence, environment, and vulnerability. Concrete walls do not bend for celebrity. Institutional systems do not care about former glory.